everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Today we have Professor Diana Raffman, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Toronto, and she will be presenting Sorites and the semantic power of arbitrariness. So off to you, Diana.
Thank you. I don't mind at all being interrupted as I'm going, especially I'm fine with taking questions from those of you who aren't familiar with vagueness, so just raise your hand, that's no problem at all. Over the last 50 years or so, philosophers have thrown everything but the kitchen sink at the Sorites paradox. Just for example, they have tried multi-valued, degree theoretic, supervaluationist, intuitionist, contextualist, pragmatist, epistemicist, and even nihilist treatments of the famous puzzle, employing all manner of semantic and logical machinery. But nothing approaching consensus has emerged. Granted, lack of consensus is hardly unusual in philosophy, but the materials needed to generate the paradox seem so simple and so intuitive that our failure to resolve it is at least worthy of reflection. Maybe the requisite formal structures or techniques haven't been discovered, or I should say haven't yet been discovered. Plenty of them have been discovered, or aren't yet sufficiently developed. Or maybe the Sorites is, after all, unsolvable, a genuine paradox. But I want to suggest a more modest possibility. And that is that we have been using the wrong equipment. We have been using sophisticated theory and technique to solve a fundamentally intuitive problem. A paradox is an argument in which the premises seem intuitively true and the reasoning seems intuitively valid, but the conclusion seems intuitively false. My teacher, Ruth Marcus, drummed this into me from the time I was just starting graduate school, and I think it's something that a lot of people writing about vagueness and surreticality have lost sight of. Intuition has a very large role to play in this paradox. Ideally, then, the resolution of a paradox will be intuitively at least as plausible and square with ordinary speech at least as well as the paradox itself. With that goal in mind, in what follows, I'm going to suggest a way of thinking about the Sorites that appears to resolve it using resources drawn almost entirely from ordinary language. Then I'll consider the significance of this account for our puzzle in decision theory, Warren Quinn's much discussed paradox of the self-torturer. Some of you may know a great deal more about that puzzle than I do, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it. One further remark before I dive into the body of the paper, I want to emphasize at the start that the application of a presumptive Soritical term, I say presumptive because I'm going to be saying in the end there are no Soritical terms. So I call it presumptive for now. I'm presuming there are Soritical terms in natural language. So what I want to emphasize is that the application of such a term is judgment or response dependent. Whether such a term applies in a given instance is determined at least partly by the judgments of ordinary competent speakers. I was thinking about this earlier today. It may not be, expertise may enter in at times. For example, many legal expressions, I don't need to tell you this, are both vague and also probably response dependent. But it will still require some degree of expertise to unpack their meanings. So there are fine shades of meaning there. But my intuition is that we shouldn't need any philosophical, logical, or semantic technique in order to solve this problem. This dependence may be most obvious in perceptual or secondary quality terms like blue and warm, but rich, old, adult, and intelligent, to name just a few, are also response dependent. It may well be that all vague words are response dependent. I think that's probably correct, but that's a topic we can save for later. This aspect of Soritical terms, their response dependence, will loom large in our treatment of the paradox. In case any among you are not yet familiar with Professor Enducot's superb work on vagueness, and I have in mind here especially his book, and I'm going to reprimand you. If you're not familiar with it, you should be familiar with it. Familiarize yourself with it right away. But in case you're not yet, I'll begin with a quick introduction to the Sorites paradox. The Sorites is an ancient puzzle, first formulated in 400 BC. That doesn't speak very well for philosophy, so I try not to emphasize too much that we're still working on this problem that was first formulated that long ago. But there it is. First formulated in ancient times, appears to be generated by vague terms. Where vague terms are terms with blurred or fuzzy boundaries of application. There is no clear or sharp division between the things to which they apply and the things to which they don't. Prime examples are the words tall, rich, blue, adult, and intelligent. No sharp line divides tall buildings from above average ones, or old people from middle-aged ones, or blue objects from green. Lack of sharp boundaries is typically associated with the terms being tolerant. It's a term that I think was introduced by Crispin Wright some decades ago. Lack of sharp boundaries is typically associated with the terms being tolerant, that is, with its applying across or tolerating incremental differences on the dimensions that decide its application. All else being equal, if two buildings differ in height by a centimeter, either both are tall or neither is. And if two people differ in age by 1 day, either both are old or neither is. Tiny differences like that make no difference to the application of the term will be called, in Wright's term, marginal. I actually typically call them incremental differences. So don't be worried if I inadvertently slide back and forth between those two terms. Vagueness is philosophically important for many reasons, but most of all because it seems to be both an essential and yet an incoherent feature of natural language. Vagueness is essential because without it, language would be useless. If words like tall and rich were precise, if they had sharp boundaries of application, knowing whether a building is tall would require measuring it to, for example, the millimeter. And knowing whether someone is old would require determining her age to something like days, a number of days. On the other hand, the use of vague words appears to lead to incoherence. Consider a series of annual salaries of, say, American adults in 2024. I had to stick with American examples just because I know the kinds of financial ranges that are operative in the country, and so I have pretty solid intuitions about them, and I didn't want to make mistakes, so I didn't switch over to British currency. So I'll apologize for that right up front. So consider a series of annual salaries, progressing from one that clearly would make such a person, an American, rich, say $1 million a year, to one that clearly would make such a person upper middle income, hence not rich, say $300,000. And suppose that each salary is $1 lower than the last. Since the application of the word rich tolerates incremental change in the salary, it seems we can generate the following paradoxical argument. And here I'm giving it to you in its inductive form. First premise, $1 million is a rich annual salary. Second premise, also known as the inductive premise, for any number n, if n dollars is a rich salary, then n minus $1 is a rich salary. Conclusion, therefore, $300,000 is a rich salary. For present purposes, I'm taking that conclusion to be false. Okay, I would be delighted with a salary of $300,000 a year, but just for the purposes of the example. Seemingly true premises and seemingly valid reasoning deliver a false conclusion. This argument is an instance of the Sorites paradox, and every degree vague word is susceptible to it. If it isn't clear what I mean by degree vague, let me know and I can explain it later on. How are we to make sense of this result? Are vague words really incoherent, or is something wrong with the paradoxical argument? Since we seem to make coherent use of vague words, do not normally land in absurdities like the one above. And because the vagueness of these words appears essential to our ability to communicate using language, most theorists of vagueness suppose that the paradox is solvable. In other words, that a satisfactory diagnosis can be given of what goes wrong in the paradoxical argument. Many attempts have been made, usually targeting the major premise. Just for example, one proposed solution has it that the second premise is false because it would be false on every acceptable way of making the word rich precise. In other words, no matter where a sharp boundary between rich and not rich is drawn. Another treatment proposes that because each salary in the series is incrementally less rich than its predecessor, each instance of the second premise is slightly less than true. These slight deficits in truth pile up as we proceed along the series, so that the conclusion ends up less true than any of the premises. So that's the degree theoretic solution. The truth values of the premises just kind of peters out as you go down the series. Still, another view contends that the second premise of the paradox is false because there is, after all, a sharp boundary between neighboring values in a Sorites series, but we can't know where it lies. Some of you probably are familiar with this view, as it has been developed most notably by Professor Williamson. That's called the epistemic theory of vagueness, the epistemic solution. In addition, some approaches hold that the truth value of the major premise is indeterminate, and some even say that it has no truth value at all. These are just some examples, and there are many others. Unfortunately, each of these proposals seems to me, at least, to have undesirable consequences, such as a counterintuitive or ad hoc revision of standard logic and/or semantics, or an implausibly weakened conception of vagueness, or a failure to provide a uniform resolution of all versions of the paradox. The variety of problems that theories of vagueness have seemed to face. As I indicated above, I want to suggest a treatment that is seems to me more intuitive, I should say, and so presumably closer to the character of the paradox itself. I'll start by noticing that the major premise, or I should say noting that the major premise is false. We know it's false because we know that as we proceed along the series, considering each salary in turn, we will, indeed on pain of incompetence, we must stop applying rich at some point between neighbors. At some point, we will arrive at salaries n dollars and n minus $1, such that n is rich and n minus 1 is only upper middle income. If those example categories don't feel right to you, then feel free to substitute ones that you think are more plausible. Nothing that I'm going to do will hinge on the use of these particular categories. Okay, so we will arrive at a break in the series. At best, then, the paradoxical argument is unsound. Of course, the trouble is that, despite its truth, the latter claim is intuitively unsatisfying. The major premise still seems true. Why? If the premise is false, why does it seem true? That's supposed to be a question whose answering is fundamental to any adequate response to the paradox. But you would be surprised how rarely this kind of question is actually directly addressed. What you typically get, and I'm as guilty of this as the next person, are alternative views, alternative ways of thinking about this or that. You can do that if your alternative way of thinking is clearly at least as intuitively plausible as the way of thinking that's your target. But that's not typically true in the literature. So that's what I want to press on. So the question is, if the premise is false, why does it seem true? Consider that when you go to evaluate the premise, you have to think about two arbitrary salaries pairwise, simultaneously. You have to place them before the mind, as Descartes might have said, and compare them. How else could you do it? Among other things, the fact that, for example, you judge n dollars rich at noon, but n plus $1 only upper middle income at 3 o'clock, or n dollars rich when you have a headache, but n plus $1 as upper middle income after you take an aspirin, or that you judge n dollars rich, whereas I judge n plus $1 upper middle income, must be irrelevant to the evaluation of the major premise. Were those examples clear to everyone? The requirement is that you be considering them together. It's not going to show anything one way or the other if today I say a given income is rich and tomorrow I say it's middle income. There's nothing seemingly paradoxical about that. Okay, moreover, when you judge neighboring salaries pairwise, you must put both in the same category. on pain of linguistic incompetence. Either both salaries are rich or neither is. This much is guaranteed by the incremental character of the difference between them. Being incremental just consists in being sufficiently small as to leave the application of rich unaffected. That's a way in which Crispin Wright has often talked about the puzzle. Indeed, this is just what the tolerance of a soritic predicate guarantees. In other words, that for incrementally different values considered pairwise, either both are phi or neither is. The upshot is that the major premise is false, but seems true due to its required, namely pairwise, mode of evaluation. In contrast, we know that when we consider the salaries singly, one at a time, we eventually arrive at one such that we classify it as rich, but its successor as, for example, upper middle income. Is that much clearer? Yeah? Okay, feel free to ask me if something isn't clear. If the paradoxical argument is to be sound, then it must employ an implicit pairwise reading of the major premise. And I formulated that in the following way. For any number n, if $n is a rich salary, then n-1 too is a rich salary. Not simpliciter, as in the paradox, but with this requirement, this rider, insofar as $n and n-1 are considered or judged pairwise at the same time in a single judgment. But now the argument, the paradoxical argument, equivocates. For the first premise and the conclusion refer only to incomes considered singly, and the considerations just raised make clear that the difference between pairwise and singular judgments makes all the difference to the application of a vague word like rich. In particular, from the fact that, say, $500,000 considered singly is a rich salary, and the independent fact that $500,000 and $499,999 are both rich when considered pairwise. Nothing follows about $499,999 considered singly. Considered singly, $499,999 may be only upper middle income. Up to a certain point in the series, the fact that all of the salaries at issue are rich tends to mask the fact that in each instantiation of the argument, the truth of the conclusion is secured independently of the premises. So at each step of the argument, it looks like you're doing modus ponens and you're inferring the conclusion from the two premises. And I don't think that's what can be happening, given that there is this equivocation going on. In fact, you are independently asserting the conclusion of each step in the argument. And for a long time, those conclusions all come out to be true. Why? Because you started up at the rich end of the series. So they are all true for quite a while. The problem only starts to manifest itself when you get into a region where it starts to become more plausible that the conclusion is false, or at least questionable. Okay, so far so good, but a relevant question remains. What should we say about a Sorites series that consists of pairs of salaries? So 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, in that manner. In this condition, we have to shift from rich to upper middle income between neighboring pairs. For some n, we classify the pair n plus $1 and n as rich, and the pair n/n minus 1 as upper middle income. Thus, n is classified as rich when it's considered in the first pair, but as upper middle income when considered in the second pair. This condition reveals clearly the labile character of the category memberships of the salaries in the Sorites series. It helps to explain how we can shift categories in such a series without ever pairwise discriminating between neighboring incomes. Instead, we redescribe or relabel a single shared income, shared between two pairs, two consecutive pairs. We redescribe or relabel a single shared income, thus enabling a smooth transition from one pair to the next. So I used to think of it as a kind of concealment, that we camouflage the shift, this categorical shift, by doing it across two pairs that share a member. I actually think we don't even need to say that much, and what I think we can say instead will become clear here in this next section. Even if the above line of reasoning is acceptable as far as it goes, it isn't yet adequate to fully intuitively resolve the paradox. On the face of it, the idea of a category shift between neighbors in a Sorites series seems nearly as counterintuitive for singular classifications as it does for pairwise ones. How can such an insignificant difference make in other words, the difference between consecutive members of the series, how can a difference that small make for a difference in category or kind? How can such a difference even be permissible, much less justified? I actually probably shouldn't say it quite like that. I don't think it will be right for me to say that it's justified. I think to talk about justification may be a kind of category mistake, but certainly I'm willing to say it's permitted. It will be permitted. So how can a categorical difference between two adjacent members of this series be permissible? We can begin to see how by keeping in mind two constraints on the competent application of the words rich and upper middle income. First, the shift from the one predicate to the other must occur in the region of overlap between the two categories, not amongst their clear cases. Here, the two categories, in other words, in their overlap, the two categories are necessarily coextensive. That's the first reason, that's the first constraint we need to keep in mind. Second, the specific location of the category shift must be otherwise arbitrary. Competence with the word rich requires that there be no reason, no justification in the nature of the case for halting its application at any particular income. One must stop someplace in the overlap, but at no particular place. I don't know exactly how to unpack that. There's something very strange about saying you must stop. So you're required to stop at no particular place. That's a very strange kind of requirement. It makes sense to say you're required to stop at a particular place. But how do you require someone to stop at no particular place? So I'll have a few things to say about that, but it's a distinctive feature of I think, the solution to the puzzle. You must stop someplace in the overlap, but at no particular place. Presumably, our stopping places are determined by brute psycholinguistic mechanisms outside conscious awareness. We could say that the particular locations of the shifts have causes but no reasons. With this pair of constraints in mind, I want to emphasize that incomes in the overlap between rich and upper middle income can be classified equally as rich and as upper middle income. That's distinct from classifying them as rich and upper middle income, right? I think that would be problematic. That would be some sort of necessary falsehood, at least on the face of it. So I think they must be classified equally as rich and as upper middle income. This fact, if it is a fact, helps to demystify our ability, our permission, if you like, to shift from the one term to the other between incrementally different values in the series. We are shifting not between clear cases, but between cases that warrant both classifications. I previously thought to say that in this region of the series, a shift from rich to upper middle income is merely incremental, in keeping with the idea that there is an incremental difference between consecutive figures here. But that's both too much and too little. In fact, what I want to say is that the shift is merely terminological. From the term rich to the term upper middle income, it is a mere shift of labels, reflecting that before long we will be required to say upper middle income, and we need to make the shift while it's still merely terminological, hence optional. Of course, I don't mean to suggest, and certainly not to require, that we explicitly think to ourselves, I need to shift to the new term while the shift is still merely terminological. Otherwise, I'm going to get into trouble. This is, I don't mean anything that sort of psycholinguistic, that literal. Maybe it's more perspicuous to say that we anticipate encountering upper middle income salaries, and so shift predicates in the overlap in order to minimize disruption to the series. Doing that could enable us to shift from rich to upper middle income without establishing or even reflecting any sort of boundary. In the region of categorical overlap in the middle of the series, there is no difference between being rich and being upper middle income. So I'm imagining that this is a purely terminological shift. It's just a labeling shift that is going to make it possible for us to be able to use another predicate later on in the series. We have to anticipate that we're going to need to do that. Okay, those are the bare bones of my thinking about the paradox. I'll close by considering some possible implications of this treatment of the paradox for Warren Quinn's puzzle of the self-torturer. Do any of you know this puzzle? Are you familiar with it? No? You are? I hope it will be of some interest to legal scholars, legal theorists. In Warren Quinn's, it's very much discussed by ethics, the people in ethics and decision theory, ethics and decision theory. In Warren Quinn's Paradox of the Self-Torturer, a person has agreed, for reasons obscure to non-philosophers, to wear a device that delivers a sustained but imperceptible electrical shock. Every time I read this line, I'm reminded of this episode with my teacher, Ruth Marcus, in which I was just starting to work on this paradox. And I was describing the setup to her, and she said, "Why would anybody agree to do this?" She just thought the whole thing was so crazy that speculating about why someone is doing what he's doing after having been hooked up was kind of just bizarre. I didn't have a good answer for her. I don't know why anyone would do it. Only a philosopher would think of this. Okay, so this person has agreed to wear a device that delivers a sustained but imperceptible electric shock. She is then offered the following trade-off. She will receive a large sum of money, say $100,000, if she agrees to increase the voltage on the device by an indiscriminable amount. In fact, she will be offered the same trade-off again each time she raises the voltage, and she knows this. Moreover, she also knows that once she has set the shocking device at a given intensity, she cannot return to an earlier lower setting. She's stuck. There is no going back, as it were. At each step, she can raise the voltage, but she can never lower it. Surely, if she's rational, she should raise the voltage at each step of the way. After all, each rise in voltage makes no difference in pain. We've stipulated that. No difference in pain, hence is well worth a gain of $100,000. So it would be irrational to do otherwise. But of course, in so doing, she will eventually reach a stage so painful that she would gladly return all of the money and maybe even pay some in addition to be restored to the initial pain-free setting. Thus, the self-torturer appears to face a dilemma. No matter which choice she makes, continue indefinitely or stop at some point, her action seems irrational or leads quickly to a state of affairs that no rational person would accept. In particular, her seemingly ordinary preferences fail to meet what are her preferences? I'd rather have more money than less, and I'd rather have less pain than more. Those seem preferences we could all share. Her seemingly ordinary preferences fail to meet a seemingly fundamental constraint on rational choice, namely that one's preferences be transitively ordered. Not surprisingly, Quinn's paradox has generated a lot of discussion in the philosophical literature, and then I cite several papers. In particular, commentators disagree as to whether the self-torturer paradox can be resolved in the same way as the Sorites. I think probably most ethicists would say that it requires a different solution. And I'm going to suggest, I thought that at one time, but I don't think that's right anymore. As I see it now, the Achilles heel of the self-torture scenario is the claim that, quote, each rise in voltage makes no difference in pain, end quote. That's insufficiently qualified and too strong as a result. The most that can be said is that the members of each pair of voltages seem the same when they are administered pairwise, simultaneously. You see, I'm harking back to the treatment of the Sorites paradox. In other words, quote, each rise in voltage makes no difference in pain. That's Quinn. In other words, each rise in voltage makes no difference in pain insofar as the two voltages are felt simultaneously. Among other things, even though, let's suppose, voltage level N administered singly is bearable, and N plus 1 are both bearable when administered pairwise, nothing follows about how N plus 1 will feel when administered singly, or a fortiori pairwise with N plus 2. Level N plus 1 may be bearable when paired with N, but not when paired with N plus 2. By the same token, level N may be bearable by itself, but not when paired with level N plus 1. So I'm drawing an analogy here. I'm supposing that we can treat the self-torturer scenario in a manner analogous to the way in which I was suggesting for vague words. Of course, given the inevitably variable relationship between voltage and pain on the one hand, and between pain and its tolerability on the other, the self-torturer cannot know in advance where the first unbearable voltage setting will come in the series. So she cannot know in advance how the voltages in the borderline region of the series will feel when administered either singly or pairwise with their successors. Her problem is ultimately epistemic. Perhaps she will exhibit something analogous to enhanced contrast and stop increasing the voltage well before encountering any borderline cases, right? Maybe she'll just say, well, I'm not even going to go close to this, so I'm going to stop way early and just sacrifice the money. I don't want to take any chances. That would be, I think, a rational strategy. Or maybe she is desperately in need of a large sum of money and will dare to go further into the borderline region. But however exactly she handles her situation, her response can be entirely rational. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you for listening.